Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. So today I'm going to be talking about the work that I've been doing at Tegria and Providence, using generative AI to teach empathy in healthcare through the use of a novel cognitive and emotional multi-agent architecture that we've developed. So first, just a little bit of background on Tegria and Providence. So I'm a senior data scientist at Tegria. We're a top global consulting firm. We have over 1,500 consultants with deep expertise and knowledge in healthcare. And our goal really is to deliver comprehensive healthcare solutions. And we've worked with a variety of hospitals and medical providers across the United States, including Providence, who we've had the pleasure of working with on this project. And as I'm sure many of you know, Providence is one of the largest healthcare providers in the Pacific Northwest. They also have hospitals in Alaska, New Mexico, and Texas. And their mission really is health for a better world. And one of the ways that they sought to do this was to improve the interactions between patients and clinicians, especially for those patients experiencing end-of-life care. And that will be the focus of my talk today. And they really wanted to help caregivers have more thoughtful, empathetic conversations that really focused on the patient's needs and values when building a treatment plan. So you might ask, well, why is this so important? Well, the truth is that, unfortunately, medical providers are given little, if any, instruction on how to have these very difficult, emotionally charged conversations, sometimes less than 15 minutes of instruction throughout their total career. And these can be some of the most difficult conversations that a patient may have with their clinician. And, it's not entirely the fault of the caregiver. As a society, especially in Western culture, we're oftentimes discouraged from talking about death and dying. And so providers are tasked with navigating these really difficult conversations on top of trying to provide the best possible care for their patients. And having these types of conversations is not just a one-off skill that you can check off on a box, right? It's really something that you want to hone and improve upon over time. And so there's a fantastic group at Providence called the Institute for Human Caring that's led by a group of palliative care physicians, and this is the group that we've partnered with. And they have a current empathy training that they have developed in Providence for other palliative care physicians. That's currently comprised of 3 parts. And so the first part is an in-person session where the physicians spend a couple of hours. They get to learn about the Serious Illness Conversation Guide, which is a framework for how to have these types of conversations. So the physician first introduces themselves. They ask the patient, do I have the permission to talk with you about this? They ask them how much knowledge they have about their condition. Oftentimes, patients will go into these conversations and think that, they're okay and not realize, how serious their diagnosis is. And then it's, again, the goal of the clinician to create a plan of care for these patients based on the patient's needs and values. So if it's really important for the patient to spend their remaining days at home rather than in the hospital, then the doctor needs to respect that and build that plan of care based on those patients' needs and values. The second part of the training is just an online training tool where the doctors kind of can, learn more about what they learned about in person. It's a self-paced tool. And then the third part, which some would argue is the most important, this is the role play part. This is where the doctors get to practice with a standardized patient actor having these types of conversations, right? But unfortunately, due to time and cost constraints, they may only have 1 or 2 hours to get to practice these conversations before they have to go back into the clinic. And so unfortunately, while this training is absolutely fantastic, it's not scalable, right? And so as a result, only 7% of the workforce at Providence has been trained over 9 years in this training. And of course, the goal for Providence is to have all caregivers go through this training. And so what the Institute wanted to do is partner with us to help them expand that role play component to create a virtual training experience where doctors can have these realistic end-of-life conversations with patients for a fraction of the cost of what it would cost to use a standardized patient actor. And caregivers can do this as often as they want, for as long as they want throughout their careers. Okay, so what does that look like? What is empathy at scale? So the training tool that we've developed is called Empathy AI, and we're using LLMs to play the role of these standardized patient actors. And we knew that in order for this tool to be successful, the first thing that we needed to do was to create realistic patient personas that felt like real patients, right? Now, keep in mind, we're not trying to fool the trainees into thinking they're talking to a real person. They know they are talking to a chatbot, but it is important that these personas feel realistic, right? And in order to do that, we need to make sure that the trainees feel like it's a valuable training experience that they're getting, that they can learn from and build upon, and then go apply in real life scenarios. So how do we get these realistic cognitive and emotional states? Obviously, I'll be talking about this more in depth later, but just know that right now for emotional states, we're using anger, and for cognitive states, we're using trust and confusion, or medical understanding. And again, I'll speak more about that in a little bit, but know that it's important during the course of these conversations for these personas to respond dynamically, right, as the conversation changes in response to what the doctor is saying. So if the doctor, again, tells the patient, like, hey, we've tried a lot of things, there aren't really a lot of options left for you, and the patient didn't realize that, then they should be expressing some sort of shock, some sort of anger, right? And that should change, again, over the course of the conversation. Another important thing that we wanted to include in our tool was an AI coach. So when trainees are talking to these standardized patient actors, very often there will be an experienced palliative care physician that's overseeing the conversation and providing feedback to the trainee, telling them, hey, that went really well. Hey, you might want to think about doing this. Or if the trainee gets stuck, making a suggestion for what they could say next. And we knew that we wanted to include that as part of a comprehensive training experience for these physicians. Okay. So that all sounds great, but as many of you know, LLMs, especially GPT-4o, which is the persona we were using, sometimes it can be very cheerful and very helpful and oftentimes very loquacious. And this is pretty much the opposite of what we want our patient personas to do. And so you might think, well, why not just use fine-tuning? Why not just use RAG? Great suggestions. Unfortunately, almost none of the conversations between the standardized patient actors and the trainees over these 9 years were recorded. And so we really didn't have anything to go off of. And the standardized patient actors, oftentimes when they would come in, they're given just a piece of paper that says, hey, this is your name, this is your condition, and you're sad about this or you're worried about this. And then the standardized patient actors are allowed to just riff and act within the realm of that, but they're given a lot of freedom. And so we didn't have a lot of patient personas to go off of that we could use for this tool. So we really had to start from scratch a lot of ways. And we really had to figure out how we're going to override this default LLM persona and get it to act like realistic patients that have their own emotions, their own hopes, their own fears, etc. Okay, so now I'll talk to you a little bit about the patient personas and kind of the prompt engineering that we went through. So here in our tool, we have 4 patient personas: Lisa, Esther, Jake, and Alex. And Alex was named before I got on the project. And so each one of these patients, unfortunately, has some sort of critical or terminal illness, but they all have their own unique character and personality. And so I'll describe to you the process, the quite lengthy process, actually, that we went to get these personas. And so the LLMs got 2 parts of a prompt. There's what we're calling the standard prompt, which is the prompt that all of them got. And then there's a personalized prompt that was unique to each one of those personas. And so we are talking about LLMs. There's going to be a lot of text here. You don't have to necessarily read it all, but I just wanted to kind of show you the wording that we're using and the main messages that we're trying to get across to these LLMs to get them to kind of behave the way that we want them to. So it was really important that we drilled in the fact that they are patient actors, they are not clinicians. Very early on, before we did this, the LLM would suddenly switch into doctor mode and start diagnosing themselves and giving suggestions for their own treatment, which was obviously not very realistic. And so again, we're just trying to emphasize, like, you are an actor, you're not a clinician. We really wanted to make sure that they didn't just tell the doctor everything about themselves up front. Again, LLMs want to be very helpful. We really want to make sure that they're kind of holding back and making sure that the doctor is doing the work to reveal that information. Again, always respond naturally, show depth and variation, always be authentic, never act as a doctor. And then this last one, again, early on in our prompting, the LLMs would explicitly state, like, I'm feeling really angry right now. And unfortunately, in real life, actually, people almost never do that. People tend to convey their emotional state by their body language, or the words that they're using, or the tone that they're using. And of course, we don't have body language in this tool. Right now, the doctors can either type responses to the patients, or they can talk in speech to text. But we didn't want the patients to be, again, explicitly naming their emotions, and so we encouraged them to find more creative ways to express that. Okay, so again, that was the standard prompt that everyone got, but now I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the personalized prompt that each one of these 4 personas got. So there's 2 main parts to it. The first one is biographical details and medical background. And when the doctor goes on to the training tool, they're actually given most of this information up front. They need to know, who they're talking to, what the medical condition is that they're going to create the treatment plan around. But then there's a whole backstory, and the doctor does not have any of this information, right? This is what they're supposed to uncover over time throughout the conversation. And after many rounds of prompt engineering, we landed on kind of 4 main parts to this backstory. And we chose this format because we realized that it was, structured enough that we could continuously reuse it whenever we wanted to create more personas. But it was unique enough and flexible enough that each patient could have their own personality, and that's really what we wanted. And so again, I'm not going to dive into each one of these, but no, for each one of these bullet points, we wrote out for each persona how they should respond. And just to give you an example, Esther, she's kind of an older woman. She has CKD and diabetes, and she's really kind of come to terms with the fact that her life is nearing its end. She's open to talking about death and dying. She's open to talking about a treatment plan. Lisa, on the other hand, she's a very young medical student and is having a really hard time coming to terms with the fact that she's not going to get to finish medical school and there are no viable treatment options left for her condition. And so Lisa is much more closed off and really does not want to talk about a treatment plan or options. She just wants to see if there's anything left that they can do, that the doctor can do for her. And again, it's the responsibility of the doctor to show empathy and get her to kind of a state where she's willing to talk about her trade-offs and treatment plan. Okay, so now I'm just going to show you a little bit, this is our prompt engineering cycle. I'm sure this is familiar to many of you. We'd, of course, update the patient persona, then run through a series of conversations. We would then annotate and analyze these conversations. We did all the analysis in Databricks, which has made our lives so much easier, honestly. And so during these annotations, what we would do is we would say, okay, well, the doctor said this. We'd have a series of maybe 10 utterances or exchanges back and forth between the doctor and the LLM. And we'd say, okay, the doctor said this, and this is how the LLM responded. Does that sound like something that a human would say, right? Why or why not? And that was actually really hard. We ended up getting into some kind of deeply philosophical debates, which is part of what made this project so fun. So we would, have conversations. Does this sound realistic? Why or why not? And then we would also hide the cognitive and emotional state from the annotators. And so let's say we knew that anger, all the emotions are on a scale of 0 to 10. For anger, 10 is like blind rage, 0 is the Buddha. And so let's say that the patient was at a 7 of 10. We would ask the annotators, like on a scale of 0 to 10, how angry do you think this patient is, right? And it's not so important that they also guess 7 of 10, but we do want to understand, like, if the patient is actually angry, is that being conveyed to the trainee? And then, of course, we would be consulting with our subject matter experts continuously. We'd meet weekly with them. And because they've been through so many of these conversations, we'd ask them, like, is this something that you've heard patients say in the clinic? Why or why not, right? Okay, now to just kind of guide you through some of the responses that we're getting from these patients using an old prompt. I won't show you the prompt, but here you can see the doctor is asking Alex, one of the patients, what are your most important goals? And early on in the prompt engineering, someone wrote in Alex's prompt, when you get stressed out, you speak in sports metaphors. And Alex is a track coach. So in theory, you can see why this might be something you'd want to include. For people who've done prompt engineering, you know that you really have no idea what the LLM is going to, quote unquote, pay the most attention to. So the LLM just loved this and would just, every other sentence would be some sort of like really kind of lame sports metaphor, right? And this is just not how people talk in real life, right? You might imagine like a track coach from the 50s in a movie maybe talking like this, but this is just not something that you would see in the clinic. And so we had to undergo many more rounds of prompt engineering, develop that backstory prompt like I mentioned, and now we can get into more realistic responses. So here, the doctor is telling Alex, he's delivering what we call delivering a headline, where the doctor is saying, hey, like there are no treatment options left. And Alex did not really know that his condition was that serious. He has a little bit of a problem with denial. And so he says like, whoa, like am I dying? Like, I really just want to keep my dignity and stay alert and spend my time at home, right? And so this is obviously a much better response than the ones we were originally getting. Throughout our prompt engineering and testing, we'll act as very empathetic doctors. We'll also act as very rude doctors. We're trying to stress test these patients and kind of see what is the extent of the response that we're going to get from them. So I was actually the doctor in this case writing out these responses, and I was just pretending to be a trainee that just wanted to get through the training as fast as possible, being kind of rude, didn't really care. I was just like, let's go, like let me know what you want so I can get out of here, basically. And here you can see this is actually Alex again, and he's responding that's saying like, hey, can we please slow down? Like I can't just switch gears. I can't go as fast as you want me to. And again, this is what we want from the patients, right? This is still a training experience. We want them to be able to guide the doctors back to the right path if they're going off the rails a little bit, and to make sure that the doctors are following that serious illness conversation guide and trying to get them to be a little more empathetic. This is just another example, again, of the doctor talking to Lisa, saying, hey, like delivering another headline, you could become really sick. And again, she's like, I'm having a really difficult time with this. Like, this is not what I expected. And again, this is very difficult to get GPT to do this out of the box, right? Here, this is just an example of one of us talking to Jake. Jake really struggles. He's very angry. He starts off really upset. He doesn't want to talk to the doctor. He doesn't want to give them any information. And again, it's the responsibility of the doctor to show that empathy and get him to kind of open up and calm down. And again, very difficult to get GPT to respond like this without an extremely overly prescriptive prompt or continuous reprompting. Okay, so now that I've kind of showed you the responses that we're looking for, that we've gotten, I'll give you a peek behind the curtain into this architecture that we've developed. And it's really quite straightforward. So it's more complex than this, don't worry. So here you have your human caregiver talking or chatting with your LLM. And what we needed to do was to have another agent, a conversation agent that we're calling them, monitor the conversation and do some sort of analysis on it. And I'll talk in depth about what both of these analyses are. But just know for right now that we're really looking to see, the agent is looking to see, like, is the doctor showing empathy? Is the doctor following the serious illness conversation guide? And then it's going to update the emotional and cognitive state of the patient. So again, those scales, it's 0 to 10 for all of the states. So anger might go from 1 of 10 to 2 of 10 or to 3 of 10. And the LLM has definitions, and I'll show you this on the next slide, definitions for how it should respond at each of these emotional states. And so before it replies to the caregiver, it gets its updated emotional and cognitive state and then replies at those levels. We also have our coach agent, like I mentioned, and again, this is another agent that's monitoring the conversation and giving real-time feedback to the caregiver. And one of the most important things is that it gives suggestions for what the caregiver should say next in case they get stuck. This is a really important thing, and so the caregiver can, get the suggestion from the coach agent and use that directly in the conversation to keep it going, and so they don't just, get stuck at certain points and start over. So it really allows for a nice conversation flow. Just very briefly, the technical architecture that we're using. Here we're hosting this on AKS, and as I mentioned, we're using OpenAI and Azure, and we're storing our conversations in PostgreSQL. But with all the exciting releases from Databricks using Mosaic AI, obviously we're definitely interested in exploring that as well. Okay, so what do these definitions for these states look like? So I'll just throw them up on the screen real quick here. So again, anger, 7 of 10, the patient's really frustrated and angry. And actually, if the anger level specifically goes above a 9, there is a pop-up that comes up on the tool that tells the doctor, like, hey, this patient has become too upset and they've left the room. And the doctor receives immediate feedback on where that conversation went wrong. And this is, really important because even Jake, who's at, I think, a 6 or 7, if you're showing him empathy and talking to him, he should never go above a 9. Like, things went really wrong and off the rails if you are making the patient that upset. And again, it's a training tool, and we want to make sure we're giving immediate feedback to these doctors. Trust. So we really wanted to include trust because, again, even though we gave explicit instructions for the LLM to not reveal too much of their story immediately, we also thought that trust, it's important for the relationship between you and your clinician, right? And it is something that should be built over time. And we knew that we wanted to include that to kind of model that realistic relationship between a patient and a clinician. For confusion, this is how much a patient, again, understands about their own diagnosis. LLMs have deep medical knowledge, and we wanted to make sure they weren't just, revealing everything that they knew about CKD. Also, medical providers tend to use, when they get panicked or they don't really know what to say, they tend to just default to using complex medical jargon that people don't really understand. And we wanted to make sure that if they started doing that, that's going to increase the confusion level of the patient, and they'll start to ask questions and be like, hey, I don't understand what you're talking about. Like, what does that mean? They might not even know why they're there in the room. And so these combinations of these 3 levels, we felt really helped to represent a wide breadth of what the clinician might actually see in the clinic. There's a last level that I haven't talked too much about. I'm happy to answer more questions at the end about it. In the interest of time, I won't go too much into it. But loquacity was also an important thing that we wanted to include. It's also on a scale of 0 to 10. So 0 is, no tokens. We almost never get that. The LLM usually says 1 or 2 words, up to a maximum of 100 tokens that the LLM is allowed to use in giving their response. The reason we wanted to and really needed to include this is because, as I mentioned, by default, LLMs are very loquacious. Even if you put in the prompt, like, never give a response that's longer than 4 sentences, the LLM will give you like 4 very long sentences. And we didn't necessarily want to prescribe the length of the response ahead of time, right? It's something that should be dynamic and change depending on the emotional state of the patient and the stage of the conversation that they're in. So for loquacity is actually controlled by the emotional state. So if anger is very high, trust is very low, the loquacity also is low. If the trust is high and the anger is low and the confusion is low, then the loquacity is allowed to be a little bit higher. Also, if the doctor is at a stage of the conversation where they're asking the patient, like, hey, tell me about your hopes, tell me about what's important to you, then the loquacity is allowed to be increased so the LLM can give longer responses. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about what the conversation agent is doing. And so the sentiment analysis, again, it's taking in the response from the doctor. It also has the whole conversation history as well. And it's making a judgment as to how that response should affect each one of those cognitive or emotional states. And so it can either be positive, negative, or neutral. And so, for example, for loquacity, here the agent is making the determination, like, the doctor is encouraging the patients to share their thoughts. This should increase loquacity. This is positive, and so loquacity is allowed to go up by 1. Right? If it's negative, it will go down by 1. If it's neutral, it will stay at 0. The same for trust and anger and confusion as well. And just so people know, for a given interaction, this cognitive and emotional states can't go greater than plus or minus 2 in either direction. We did this to prevent like very extreme emotional swings, like the patient going from 0 anger to 10 anger. That is something that we may actually want in the future, and I'll talk about that towards the very end. But just know that it's capped at that plus or minus 2 for right now. Okay, the conversation agent, the serious illness conversation guide analysis. So this is another analysis that's also going on simultaneously. And this is the serious illness conversation guide. I know it's a little bit hard to read, but it's created by this group called Ariadne Labs. And again, it's really just a framework that the doctors are taught for how to have these conversations. It's, I believe, like the setup stage, the share stage, the explore stage. And so we want to make sure, oftentimes the doctors will just introduce themselves and go like straight into the explore stage, right? And that's not really what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to first ask the patient like how much they understand about their diagnosis, et cetera. And so we want to make sure that the doctor is hitting those stages, and if they're not, that's going to negatively or positively impact the emotional state for the patient. We also want to check to see if any criteria have been skipped, again. That will affect the cognitive or emotional state. Okay. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the coach agent. So again, it's providing real-time feedback to these doctors, giving them responses on what they've done well, what they could improve upon. We also have a score report. I don't have too much time to talk about this, but really it just gives feedback for the doctors, like, hey, a high-level overview, you did this well, you didn't, you could improve upon this. And then we give them direct examples from that conversation that said, you said this, and this is how the patient responded. And then some suggestions on how they might want to improve that. In the future, obviously, we'd like to have this coach agent be a real-time chat with trainees, so they can actually have a separate conversation with the coach agent in real time as their other conversation is going on, which, as you might imagine, might be what they're doing with an experienced palliative care physician getting that feedback. Okay, so what are the next steps for our tool? Well, there's kind of three main parts that we'd like to hit. So first, we really obviously are always trying to improve patient realism. Everyone on the team was deeply affected by Inside Out 2, and we'd really like to add in anxiety and sadness for more realistic responses. We might even change out trust and confusion and just go with emotional states and see how that changes the patient personas. This is another important thing. We want to alter the emotional state at specific conversation points. And so when we first started doing this and talking with our subject matter experts, we were being kind of traditional, Western people saying, well, too many emotions is bad. We really, don't want the LLM to say too much or reveal too much. And the doctors were like, no. Like, if you tell someone something as serious as, like, you have no viable treatment options left, you are going to die, you should get a pretty intense and emotional reaction from someone, right? And so we want to create, at specific points of the conversation, we want to allow those emotional states to swing in a very big way. So if the patient is at, zero anger and they didn't know anything about the fact that, they didn't have any treatment options left, that anger should be allowed to swing to maybe a 6 or 7, right? And again, it's the responsibility of the doctor to knock that back down, to have empathy, to talk with the patient, and stay in that emotional place and not just immediately jump to a cognitive state, right? And just start, talking in medical jargon, that kind of thing. This is another thing that I mentioned earlier. We want to change the persona voices. So we're using Azure Speech Services right now. And right now for anger, as anger is increasing on the back end, the pitch and the prosody of the persona voice is also changing to kind of reflect a more angry state. We're still in the process of working through that, but it has been, we have gotten good feedback on it so far, which is nice. And of course, we'd like to change this, if we add in different emotional states, we'd like that speech response to change as well. Automating improvements, right now, as I've mentioned, like this whole process has been a lot of manual prompt engineering. And obviously, while, automated prompt engineering is fantastic, I do think there is some value into kind of being in the weeds and understanding each and every word of the prompt that you're using. It really helps you develop a kind of relationship with these LLMs and get a really good understanding of why they respond the way that they do. And that helps you every time you create a new version of the prompt. Now, that being said, we don't necessarily have to do this forever. We would love to add more agents and more LLMs to basically help us automatically update these patient personas as they're getting, as we're going to expand this tool right now. We just have a very small group of palliative care doctors that are testing this. Of course, we want it to go Providence-wide. But, as we start to get more and more conversations that are coming in, we want another, groups of agents to be analyzing these conversations, getting feedback from the doctors, updating the patient personas and the agent prompts, and ideally generating new personas for us as well to continue to improve the tool. And we also think that this training, could be adapted to a wide variety of different scenarios, right? Any circumstance, human resources, crisis response, where you have to deal with, difficult people, or any situation where you have a specific type of persona that you want to practice on, we feel like this framework could be, simple enough and adaptable enough that it can be used, again, for a wide variety of different trainings. Okay, so that's the talk. I'm really happy to answer any questions that people might have. I'll be around afterwards, and other members of the Tegria team are here too to discuss opportunities for collaboration to work on other projects like this or other different projects in the future. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.